The Vish'tar Fleet Command had a saying, old as their first starships, "An enemy in retreat is an enemy already defeated." They believed it, right up until the moment it killed them. This is the story of the Kesron Line, the battle that ended a war nobody outside a small circle of admirals even knew had truly started, and the 17 minutes of alien bridge chatter that got studied in academy classrooms for the next 200 years as the single greatest tactical misread in recorded galactic history. It started, as these things tend to, with contempt. The Vish'tar Dominion had been expanding for 11 centuries, not through diplomacy, through subtraction. They found young species still arguing about borders and resource rights among themselves, and they offered a simple choice: join the Dominion as a vassal race, or get removed from the strategic board entirely. Most chose vassalage. A few chose extinction, usually without meaning to. Humanity was supposed to be an easy addition to the ledger. A single-system species barely 2 centuries into spaceflight, still running on the fumes of nationalism and old grudges, according to the intelligence briefings the Vish'tar scouts filed after their first quiet surveillance passes. Fragile industrial base. Fractured command structure. No unified military doctrine to speak of, a soft target ripe for a demonstration strike that would bring the rest of the unclaimed frontier worlds to heel out of pure fear. So, the Vish'tar sent an ultimatum fleet to the edge of the Sol expansion zone, a cluster of 7 colony systems humanity had spent 40 years quietly building up beyond its original borders. The ultimatum was simple: surrender sovereignty over the expansion zone, submit to Dominion tribute law, or watch the colonies burn one at a time until compliance was achieved. Command Admiral Threz Kalon Vash, third of his bloodline to hold a Vish'tar fleet seal, did not expect humanity to fight. He expected panic. He expected a scattered response, maybe some obsolete warships thrown together in a doomed show of defiance. The kind of thing his historians would later footnote as a tragic but predictable overreaction from a species that hadn't yet learned its place in the galactic order. What he got, 3 days after the ultimatum expired, was silence. Then he got a single message. 2 sentences, delivered in accented but grammatically perfect Vish'tar trade tongue, from someone identifying themselves only as Fleet Admiral Corinne Okafor, Sol Defense Command. The message read, "The expansion zone is not for sale. Come and find out what that cost you." Threz Vash laughed when his translator finished rendering it. He had it played for his senior staff on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion cruiser Ashen Verdict, and they laughed too, the particular laugh of predators who had never once in 11 centuries been made to regret their appetite. 3 weeks later, the first Vish'tar strike group entered the Kesron system, the outermost of the 7 expansion zone colonies, expecting a formality. What they found instead was a human fleet. 41 ships, arranged in a wide defensive crescent in front of the colony's orbital shipyards, clearly outnumbered, clearly outgunned on paper, clearly there to die making a point. The Vish'tar strike group commander, a blunt and impatient officer named Dresk Ilhanar Vash, ordered an immediate advance. He expected the human line to break within the hour. He was, technically, correct. It broke within the hour. It just didn't break the way he thought it would. Oh, the human formation began compressing inward, roughly 40 minutes into the engagement, folding its outer flanks toward the center, in a slow, disciplined withdrawal that looked to every sensor operator and tactical officer on the Vish'tar side exactly like a fleet buckling under pressure and trying to consolidate before a full retreat. Dresk Vash watched the human ships pull back from their forward positions, watched their formation narrow and thicken, and made the single most expensive assumption of his career. He assumed they were breaking. He ordered his own flanks to swing wide, to loop around the collapsing human crescent and cut off the retreat before it could become an escape, to close the pincer on what he believed was a defeated force trying to save what remained of itself. It was textbook. It was exactly what the situation appeared to call for. Command Admiral Frez Vash, monitoring the engagement from 3 systems away through the relay network, approved the maneuver personally and began repositioning the 2nd and 3rd strike groups to exploit what looked like an open gap forming behind the human line, jet gap, that would let Vish'tar forces punch straight through toward the colony's shipyards and the soft infrastructure behind them. It was the natural read. It was the reasonable read. It was also catastrophically wrong, and the story of exactly how wrong it was and exactly what waited behind that compressing human line is worth telling slowly because the horror of it only builds when you understand it the way the Vish'tar bridge crew understood it. Piece by piece. Too late to matter. To understand why Fleet Admiral Corinne Okafor was willing to sacrifice 41 ships as bait, you have to go back 18 months to a briefing room on Earth that the Vish'tar never knew existed and to a woman named Dr. Amara Chen, who was about to become one of the most quietly important people in human history. Chen was not a soldier, she was a systems architect who had spent the first part of her career designing orbital infrastructure, and the second part of it, after the Vish'tar ultimatum arrived, designing something else entirely. When the Seoul Defense Council convened its first emergency session, Chen was the one who stood up and said the thing nobody wanted to hear but everyone needed to. "We cannot win a fair fight," she told them. "So, we're not going to give them one." Humanity, as it turned out, had spent the better part of a century doing something the Vish'tar surveillance passes had completely failed to notice, because they weren't looking for. They weren't building a fleet in the conventional sense. They were building redundancy, distributed manufacturing capacity, buried under a dozen different mountain ranges and asteroid claims, none of it individually impressive enough to register as a military threat, all of it quietly capable of being brought online and networked together within weeks if the right authorization codes were ever issued. It was called Project Understudy. Chen hadn't named it. Some tired procurement officer decades earlier had named it back when it was just a contingency plan, gathering dust in a drawer. A hedge against the possibility that first contact might not go well. Nobody had ever expected to actually use it. Chen was the one who dusted it off, ran the numbers, and told the Defense Council it could work if they were willing to do something that went against every human instinct about honest warfare. They were going to have to let people believe they were losing. Admiral Harry Voss, who by that point had spent 30 years in Seoul Defense Command and had exactly the kind of weathered, unbothered patience the plan required, was the one who took the operational side of it. He didn't say much in that first meeting. He listened to Chen's proposal, looked at the projected timelines and said, "So we're the show, and the real fleet's backstage." Chen nodded. "Something like that. How long to get backstage ready?" 18 months, if everything goes right. And if it doesn't... Chen didn't answer that one. Nobody in the room needed her to. What followed was 18 months of the quietest, most disciplined industrial effort in human history, conducted almost entirely outside public knowledge, authorized under emergency wartime powers that President Mateo Reyes signed into effect within 72 hours of that first Vish'tar ultimatum. Reyes was not a general and never pretended to be one. His entire contribution to the war, as he put it privately to his cabinet, was to get out of the way of the people who actually knew what they were doing and make sure nobody in Congress tried to slow them down with oversight hearings that could wait until after the crisis was resolved. "You tell me what you need," he told Voss and Chen in their first private session, "and I will find a way to get it to you before you finish asking." What they needed, it turned out, was scale. Not one shipyard. Dozens scattered and hidden and humming day and night, building a fleet that had nothing to do with the 41 ships currently sitting in the Kesarun system pretending to be humanity's entire defensive capability. The specialist team Chen assembled read like a strange cross-section of humanity's most stubborn problem solvers. There was Dr. Ilse Brenner, a metallurgist who had spent a decade before the war arguing with everyone who would listen that human hull alloys were decades behind what they could be if anyone bothered funding basic materials research properly. There was a retired naval architect named Tomas Alvarez, who had once been laughed out of a defense contractor meeting for proposing a modular ship design that could be mass-produced in weeks instead of years. There was a young propulsion engineer, barely 30, named Priya Nataraja, who had reverse-engineered fragments of derelict Vish'tar scout tech recovered from a probe that had crashed in the Pacific 11 years earlier. Tech the Dominion never even realized humanity had gotten its hands on. Every one of them had spent years being told their ideas were too expensive, too radical, too far outside the accepted doctrine. The war didn't create their genius. It just finally gave them a budget. Brenner's alloy work alone shaved 40% off the weight of standard hull plating, while doubling its tensile resistance to plasma scoring, a combination the Vish'tar Dominion, with all its centuries of martial tradition, had never bothered to pursue because nobody had ever pushed them to. Alvara's modular design meant that a hull could go from raw material to flight-ready in 11 days, instead of the standard 14 months a comparable Vish'tar cruiser required. Tenadaraja's propulsion work, built on the bones of a wrecked alien probe, gave human ships an acceleration curve that looked on paper almost like a rounding error, until you realized it meant they could outmaneuver anything the Dominion had ever fielded. None of it would have mattered on its own. Together, stacked and integrated and quietly mass-produced across every hidden shipyard on and off Earth, it added up to something the Vish'tar had no framework for understanding, because nothing in their 11 centuries of expansion had ever required them to fight an enemy. Of honor to be endured. Chen's own contribution, the one that mattered most in the end, was smaller in concept, but larger in consequence. She designed the compression formation, the maneuver that would make a devastated, retreating fleet indistinguishable from a fleet executing the opening movement of an ambush, right up until the exact moment it was too late to tell the difference. "They'll read it as a rout," she told Voss, showing him the simulation for the 40th time. "Every instinct they have will tell them it's a rout. That's what we want. We want their instincts to be right about everything except the one thing that matters." Voss studied the simulation a long time, and if they don't take the bait, if they hold back, consolidate, wait us out, then we lose a very expensive 41 ships and gain a lot of information about how cautious they are, Chen said. "But they won't hold back. I've read every report we have on Vish'tar military doctrine going back 30 years. They've never once, in any recorded engagement, failed to press an advantage when they thought they saw one. It's not just strategy for them, it's identity. They believe overwhelming aggression against a retreating enemy is a virtue. It's baked into how they train, how they promote, how they think, so we're betting the whole war on their arrogance." Chen allowed herself something close to a smile. "I'm betting the whole war on the one thing about them that's never changed in 11 centuries of expansion. They've never had to face someone who could actually hurt them back. That's not a strategy. That's a hole in the foundation. We're just going to make sure it's load-bearing when the building comes down." The plan took its final shape over the following months. 41 ships would hold the Kestron line, a real defensive engagement with real crews taking real risks. No illusions and no theatrics beyond the timing of the withdrawal itself. Behind them, hidden along a debris field and inside the radiation shadow of Kestron's outermost gas giant, a second fleet would wait. Not 41 ships, 216. Built in secret, crewed by volunteers who had trained for this exact scenario for the better part of a year without ever being told exactly when it would happen, only that when the order came, they would have minutes, not hours, to execute. Admiral Voss took personal command of the hidden fleet. It felt right to him, and nobody argued. He'd spent 3 decades believing humanity would eventually need something like this, and never quite being able to convince anyone to fund it properly, until the Vish'tar ultimatum made the argument for him. The night before the fleet moved into position, Voss walked the flight deck of his flagship, a vessel his crew had unofficially started calling the Bastard, partly because of its ungainly modular hull plating bolted together in 11 days flat, and partly because of what everyone hoped it was about to do to the Vish'tar timetable. He didn't correct them. He rather liked it. He found Chen there too, running one last check on the compression formation telemetry with her team. "You scared?" he asked her. "Professionally terrified," Chen said. "Personally, I think I ran out of fear. Somewhere around month 8, there wasn't room for it anymore." Voss nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say something. She lived through the last war humanity fought against itself, the real, ugly one, before any of this. She said the thing about people who've been through real hardship, isn't that they stop being afraid. It's that they learn fear doesn't get a vote anymore. It can show up. It just doesn't get to decide anything. Chen looked at him for a long moment. That's going on a plaque somewhere someday. God, I hope not, Voss said, and went back to walking his deck. The Vish'tar command, Admiral Threz Vash, had no idea any of this existed. Neither did Strike Group Commander Dresk Ilhanur Vash, watching from the bridge of his cruiser as the human crescent at Kesron began its slow, deliberate compression. This is where the story returns to the battle itself, and to the 17 minutes that would end up defining the rest of the war before most of the galaxy even realized the war had a second act. Dresk Vash watched his tactical display with the particular satisfaction of a predator who believed he was watching an old story play out exactly the way it always did. The human ships were pulling back from their extended flank positions. Their formation, once spread wide across nearly 200,000 kilometers to cover multiple approach vectors, was narrowing, thickening, drawing inward toward a tight defensive knot around the Kesron shipyards. They're consolidating for a last stand, his tactical officer reported, a young Vish'tar named Yaren who had never seen combat before this deployment and was visibly relieved that the enemy appeared to be folding as expected. They're panicking, Dresk corrected him. There's a difference. A last stand implies discipline. This is a species discovering in real time that its bravado has an expiration date. He gave the order to swing his flanking groups wide, curling them around the outside of the human formation like the closing fingers of a hand. It was aggressive. It was, by Vish'tar doctrine, exactly correct. You did not let a wounded enemy retreat to fight another day. You closed the gap and you finished it. Because mercy shown to an inferior species only taught the rest of the galaxy that Dominion ultimatums came with loopholes. Command Admiral Threz Vash, watching the relay feed from his own flagship 3 systems away, approved the wider strategic repositioning at the same moment. If the human line was collapsing at Kesron, there was no reason to wait for a clean mop-up before committing the 2nd and 3rd strike groups. Wad. Pierced. Better to punch through immediately, secure the shipyards intact, and use Kesron as a forward staging point for pressuring the remaining 6 colonies into surrender without another shot fired. It was, in his mind, the difference between a competent commander and an excellent one. Excellent commanders didn't wait for permission from a beaten enemy to declare the fight over. He gave the order. 2nd and 3rd strike groups, another 110 ships combined, began accelerating toward the gap that was, in his read of the tactical picture, about to open behind the collapsing human crescent. This is the moment worth sitting with, because everything that came after hinged on it. 2 Vish'tar commanders, separated by 3 star systems, but united by the same 11 centuries of unchallenged doctrine, looked at the exact same data and arrived at the exact same catastrophic conclusion. Because the data had been built from the very first compressing meter of that human formation to lead them there. The compression continued for another 11 minutes. Vish'tar sensor operators noted, with growing confidence, that human ship spacing within the shrinking formation was becoming unnaturally tight, unnaturally coordinated for a fleet supposedly disintegrating under pressure. One junior analyst on Dresk Vash's own bridge, a methodical officer named Sethis, flagged the anomaly in a routine report. "The spacing's too clean," Sethis said, mostly to himself, pulling up a comparison against known patterns of collapsing formations from the Dominion's historical archive. "Real routes are messy. Ships peel off at different rates, different vectors. This is uniform. It's like watching a fist close instead of a hand falling open." Nobody above him paid attention. Dresk Vash was busy directing the flanking maneuver. The observation went into a log that would be reviewed, if anyone survived to review it, sometime after the engagement concluded. Nobody survived to review it in time. At the 17-minute mark of the compression, the human formation finished collapsing into a tight, disciplined sphere around the Kesron shipyards. 41 ships arranged with an almost geometric precision that, viewed with any objectivity at all, looked far less like a broken fleet and far more like the closing of a door. But by then, Vish'tar strike groups were already committed, already accelerating into the positions that would let them punch through what they still believed was an open flank. That was when the debris field behind Kesron's outermost gas giant stopped being debris. 216 human ships broke from their radiation-shadowed hiding positions in a single coordinated burn, engines built on reverse-engineered alien propulsion technology, giving them an acceleration curve the Vish'tar sensor arrays flagged for one confused half-second, because nothing in the Dominion's threat catalog moved that fast. It was not a malfunction. Admiral Harry Voss, aboard the Bastard, gave the single order his crew had trained 18 months to execute. Fire lines assigned. Execute understudy. There was no dramatic speech. There was no need for one. Every crew member on every one of those 216 ships had spent nearly a year rehearsing exactly this moment. And when it came, they simply did their jobs. With the calm, practiced competence of people who had stopped being afraid a long time ago because fear didn't get a vote anymore. On the bridge of Dreskvash's cruiser, the tactical display lit up with contact icons that should not have existed. For nearly 4 full seconds, nobody spoke. Nobody could quite process what they were seeing, because everything about the picture in front of them violated 11 centuries of accumulated experience about what this species was supposed to be capable of. Sethus was the one who finally broke the silence, and his voice had lost every trace of the careful professionalism it carried a few minutes earlier. That's not a fleet. That's not Commander. That's not possible. We ran full sensor sweeps of this system on approach. There was nothing. They were behind the gas giant, Dresk said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one worse than the last. The whole time, the whole engagement. That wasn't a retreat. It was. Bait, Sethus said. The 41 ships. They were bait the entire time. Dreskvash, watching from 3 systems away, watched his second and third strike groups, already committed, already accelerating into what they believed was an open flank, sailed directly into a firing solution that had been prepared for them 18 months before either of those strike groups had even been assigned to this campaign. The human ships did not fight like anything in the Dominion's historical record. Chen's compression formation, the one that had drawn the Vish'tar in, reversed itself in the opening seconds of the counterattack, the original 41 ships snapping outward from their tight defensive sphere into a series of interlocking fire corridors that boxed the lead elements of the Vish'tar advance before they even understood they'd stopped being. The Hunters. Brenner's alloy work meant Vish'tar plasma weapons that should have scored clean hull breaches instead skated and scattered across human armor, buying critical seconds. Alvarez's modular hull sections meant that when human ships did take damage, they compartmentalized and kept fighting instead of losing entire decks to cascading failure. Nataraja's propulsion work meant human ships simply were not where Vish'tar targeting solutions predicted they would be. Again and again, an entire fleet moving with a responsiveness that no Dominion War College had ever modeled, because no species the Dominion had ever fought had bothered building for it. It made the difference the whole engagement pivoted on. Dreskvash watched 3 of his lead cruisers lose main power within the first 90 seconds of contact. Caught in overlapping fire corridors, they had no doctrine to escape because nothing in Vish'tar training had ever required them to escape a trap sprung by an enemy they still, moments earlier, believed to be broken and fleeing. "Pull back," Dresk ordered, the first crack of panic entering his voice. "Pull the flanking groups back. Reform on the second line." There was no second line to reform on. The second line was the trap. Threes, Vash, watching the disaster unfold across 3 systems of relay delay, issued the order that would define the rest of his career and the rest of the Dominion's understanding of this war. All strike groups, immediate withdrawal, full retreat to Rally Point 7. It was the correct order. It came roughly 90 seconds too late for a third of his committed forces, and it revealed something the Dominion had never had to confront before in its entire 11 centuries of uncontested expansion. They were not the ones who got to decide when this fight ended. Voss's fleet did not pursue with reckless abandon. That was the detail that unsettled Vish'tar historians for decades afterward, more than the casualties, more than the tactical brilliance of the ambush itself. The human fleet, pursued exactly as far as it needed to, inflicted exactly the damage necessary to break the cohesion of the retreating Vish'tar strike groups, and then, with the same disciplined precision that had built the trap in the first place, disengaged. It was not mercy. Boss made that clear in his after-action report and made it clearer still in the message he had transmitted on an open frequency, directly to Command Admiral Therese Vash's flagship in the minutes after the Vish'tar retreat began. "You came here to take something that was never yours to take," the message read, delivered in the same accented but precise Vish'tar trade tongue as the first ultimatum reply, though this time it was Voss's own voice carrying it rather than Okafor's written words. "We let you believe what your doctrine told you to believe, because your doctrine was the weapon we needed you to use against yourself. This is not the full measure of what we have. It is a fraction of it shown to you, because a demonstration is cheaper than a war fought to its end. Withdraw fully from the Sol expansion zone. Do not send another ultimatum. The next one will not get a courtesy warning first." The bridge of the Ashen Verdict, Therese Vash's flagship, went silent when the message finished playing. It was the same silence in a way that had followed the first human reply. 3 weeks earlier, when Therese Vash had laughed at 2 sentences he thought were empty defiance, nobody was laughing now. Therese Vash sat with that silence for a long time, watching the tactical display where the wreckage of a third of his committed forces still drifted, cooling in the space around Kesrun. He had entered this campaign believing he understood exactly what kind of enemy he was fighting. A young species? A fragile one? Fractured, undisciplined, unable to conceive of warfare on the scale the Dominion had perfected over 11 centuries of subjugating everyone unfortunate enough to sit within reach of its borders. He understood, now, sitting in that silence, that he had never been fighting the enemy. He thought he was fighting. He had been fighting a species that had spent its entire recorded history clawing its way through catastrophe after catastrophe. It had learned across all of that hardship a lesson the Dominion in all its unchallenged supremacy had never once been forced to learn, that the only strength worth trusting was the strength you built when nobody was watching. And the only victories worth having were the ones you were prepared to win before anyone knew there was a fight at all. "Set course for withdrawal," he said finally. Full compliance with the terms, nobody on his bridge argued. The formal end of the conflict came 4 months later in a negotiation that the Vish'tar Dominion, for the first time in its 11th century history, did not get to dictate the terms of. President Mateo Reyes did not attend personally, choosing instead to send Fleet Admiral Karen Okafor and Dr. Amra Chen as the human delegation, a deliberate choice that made its own point without needing a single word of explanation. The people who had planned the war and the people who had won it were the ones who got to end it. The terms were simple and delivered without theater. Full Dominion recognition of the Sol expansion zone's sovereignty. A formal renunciation of any future claim against human territory. The establishment of a demilitarized buffer along the border, monitored jointly with human inspection rights the Dominion had never in its history extended to any species it hadn't already conquered. And accountability. Therese Vash and Dresk Ilhanor Vash, along with the 3 senior Dominion officials who had authorized the original ultimatum, were named individually in the settlement, stripped of rank and command authority as a condition of the peace. It was not an execution. Chen had argued specifically against that, the final Defense Council session before the delegation departed. "We're not doing this because we want to become what they are," she said. "We're doing this because we want the next species they try this on to have a reason to believe help might actually come. If we just erase them, that's a story about power. If we hold them accountable and still let them walk away changed, that's a story about what happens when you underestimate people who've been through hell and come out the other side, still willing to build something better than revenge." The Dominion accepted every term. They had, after Kesrun, very little room to do otherwise. Word of the battle had already reached the unclaimed frontier worlds, the same worlds Therese Vash had once hoped to intimidate into submission with a clean demonstration strike against a fragile new species. It had the opposite effect. For the first time in living memory across that stretch of the galaxy, smaller powers began looking toward Sol expansion zone diplomats not as a cautionary tale, but as a precedent. Admiral Harry Voss retired 18 months after the peace settlement was signed, at an age when most people would have already retired twice over. He gave one public statement at his retirement ceremony, brief and characteristically understated, standing in front of the Bastard one final time before the ship was decommissioned and at the insistence of its own crew, preserved rather than scrapped. "People are going to want to make this into a story about how we tricked somebody," Voss said. "It wasn't a trick. A trick is something you get away with once. What we did, we could do again tomorrow, and the day after for as long as it took. The only thing we tricked them into was believing they understood us before they'd bothered to actually look. That's not cleverness. That's just what happens when you underestimate somebody. We've had a lot of practice being underestimated. Turns out it's useful, if you're patient enough to let it work for you instead of against you." Dr. Amara Chen went on to lead a new joint research division, tasked with integrating the lessons of Project Understudy into humanity's long-term defense doctrine. No longer a secret contingency buried in a drawer, but a permanent, openly acknowledged pillar of how the Sol expansion zone planned to protect itself. She gave far fewer public statements than Voss did. The one she did give, at the dedication of a memorial built at Kesron for the crews of the original 41 ships who had fought and, in 11 cases, died in the first phase of the battle before the ambush ever sprang, was the one that ended up quoted most often in the years that followed. "They didn't know the whole plan," she said, standing in front of 11 names carved into a wall that would eventually hold many more, from other engagements, other wars, other tests. The galaxy would inevitably throw at a species it kept mistaking for small. They just knew their job was to hold, and they held because they trusted that somewhere behind them other people were doing their job too. That's not a fleet. That's not a weapon. That's just what happens when people who've had to fight for everything learn to fight for each other instead of against each other. It turned out to be the most dangerous thing we ever built, and we didn't design it in a shipyard. And it's older than any of us. It's just the first time in a long time we got to use all of it at once, on purpose, together. The Vish'tar Dominion never again sent an ultimatum fleet to a species it had not thoroughly, exhaustively, and humbly studied first. Kesron became a mandatory case study at every Dominion War Academy within a decade, taught not as a story of defeat, though it was certainly that, but as a story about the specific quantifiable cost of contempt. Historians on both sides eventually settled on a phrase to describe what happened in those 17 minutes above Kesron, a phrase that made it into official Dominion military doctrine as a formal warning to future commanders evaluating any newly encountered species, no matter how young, no matter how fractured, no matter how fragile they appeared on first contact. The formation wasn't retreating, it was compressing. And somewhere behind every line a young species draws in the sand. The doctrine warned there may be something waiting that makes the line itself look like nothing more than an advanced scout for a war you didn't know you'd already started losing. That was the lesson the galaxy learned from humanity in the end, whether it wanted to or not. Underestimate people who have spent their whole history surviving the worst that existence could throw at them, and you are not looking at weakness. You are looking at the calm surface of something enormous, patient, and very, very close to finished waiting. If this kind of story hits different for you, the slow burn, the quiet dread building on the other side, the moment an arrogant enemy finally understands exactly how badly they miscalculated, go ahead and drop a like before you go. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. Subscribe and ring that notification bell if you want more stories like this one, because there are plenty more where this came from every single week. Let me know in the comments what your favorite moment was, whether it was Chen laying out the plan, Voss walking his deck the night before, or that silence on the Vish'tar bridge when they finally understood what they'd actually been looking at the whole time. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars, because you never know what's waiting quietly behind the line.